Racist woman calls police on black delivery driver, not knowing he's her new neighbor. Jane's life had always been defined by comfort and predictability. Nestled in a suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, she felt like she had found the perfect sanctuary, a place where life moved at a calm pace, and the world seemed to fit neatly into the rhythms she had grown accustomed to. This was her safe space, a small pocket of tranquility that she had carefully curated over the years. Her house, a quaint two-story building with a white picket fence and a manicured lawn, was an outward reflection of the life she had worked hard to establish. Inside, the rooms were filled with the familiar comforts of her carefully chosen decor: soft, neutral tones, cozy armchairs, and carefully placed family photos that chronicled years of happy memories. It was a home built on stability and peace. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Every morning, Jane woke up to the quiet hum of the suburban life she had become so used to. The sound of birds chirping in the trees outside her window, the distant buzz of lawnmowers starting up as her neighbors tended to their yards, these were the sounds that marked the beginning of each day. She would stretch out in bed, letting the warmth of the sun filter through the curtains, and take a deep breath before rolling out of bed and going about her routine. Coffee was the first thing on her mind. She headed straight to the kitchen, where she brewed a pot of her favorite dark roast, savoring the aroma as it filled the air. It was the start of another ordinary day. The rest of the morning was always spent in a similar pattern. Jane sat at her kitchen table, flipping through her emails and catching up on the day's tasks. A glance out of the window revealed the quiet streets outside, lined with neatly trimmed hedges and clean sidewalks. Most of her neighbors were already off to work or out with their children, and the stillness of the neighborhood allowed her to focus on her work. Jane worked from home, a freelance graphic designer who had carved out a comfortable career that allowed her to set her own hours and be the master of her time. She enjoyed the freedom it provided, even though it often meant working long hours. The convenience of working from home was something Jane cherished. Her life was unhurried, and she was content with it. Jane had always been someone who appreciated stability, someone who found comfort in the predictable ebb and flow of life. She had never felt the need to search for excitement or adventure outside of her small bubble. Her circle of friends was tight-knit, and their interactions were often confined to the occasional coffee dates or dinner parties. The conversations were pleasant, the topics light. There were no contentious debates, no discomforting discussions. She felt safe in this environment, where everyone agreed on the same basic values and life seemed uncomplicated. The neighborhood she lived in reflected her desire for stability. It was a suburban enclave, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the city, a place where people like Jane could escape the chaos and retreat into their own worlds. The houses were all similar in design, well-kept and uniform, with manicured lawns and clean driveways. The neighbors, for the most part, kept to themselves. There was a sense of unspoken understanding. Everyone respected each other's privacy, but they still exchanged pleasantries when passing by. It was a comfortable existence, one that Jane had come to rely on. Jane had always been cautious about change. She believed in maintaining the status quo, in keeping things simple and predictable. Her life had followed a pattern for years, and she had grown comfortable in this structure. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing exactly what to expect each day. Her grocery shopping trips were a well-practiced routine. She knew exactly what items she would need for the week, and she would make her way to the same stores without a second thought. The drive there was peaceful, the roads familiar, and the aisles of the grocery store were like an old friend. She knew the layout, the best time to visit to avoid crowds, and which checkout line to choose. It was effortless. Even the people in her life fit neatly into her expectations. Her neighbors, though not particularly close, were friendly in a way that allowed for easy, no-pressure interactions. She knew their names, their families, and their pets, but there was little need to delve into anything deeper. Jane liked it that way. She didn't have to worry about awkward confrontations or uncomfortable conversations. Life was smooth, and that's all she needed. She had created a world that revolved around her needs, a world where she felt safe and secure. For Jane, there was little room for uncertainty. She valued control over her environment and made sure that everything around her conformed to her idea of how things should be. She didn't seek out the unexpected because it would disrupt the peace she had cultivated. Everything, from the color of her walls to the way she organized her bookshelves, was carefully chosen to reflect her desire for order and consistency. The idea of change, especially anything that might challenge her view of the world, was something she avoided. It was easier to live in a space where she could predict the outcome of every situation, where her choices felt comfortable and safe. However, Jane's sense of control and safety came at a cost. She had closed herself off from much of the world beyond her neighborhood. While she considered herself to be open-minded and progressive, she rarely engaged in conversations that challenged her perspectives. She didn't seek out diversity in her life because, in her mind, the peaceful suburb she inhabited was already the ideal place to be. She told herself that she was socially aware, that she had friends from different backgrounds, and that she supported the idea of inclusion. But in truth, her life had become insular. She had never ventured beyond the borders of her neighborhood, and she had no real understanding of what it meant to live outside of this bubble. As the years passed, Jane's life became a rhythm of predictability. Her days were marked by the same tasks, the same patterns, the same familiar places. She had no reason to question anything, and in that sense, she had fallen into a kind of complacency. The world outside her home had never seemed urgent or pressing. She trusted that it was functioning as it should, and she didn't see any need to challenge that view. It was easier to stay within the lines, to keep to what was known and comfortable. And yet, even as she moved through her days with this sense of security, there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind. It was an inkling, a quiet voice that sometimes whispered that maybe her world was too small. Maybe there was more to life than the tidy boxes she had created for herself. But Jane quickly dismissed these thoughts. Why should she rock the boat when everything seemed fine? After all, what more could she need than the life she had already built? Stability was everything to Jane. She was content with her place in the world, and she had no reason to seek out anything beyond it. It wasn't until the arrival of a simple package that everything began to unravel. The delivery man, Malik, would be the catalyst for Jane's awakening. In that fleeting moment of seeing him outside her window, something stirred in her, a sense of discomfort she couldn't explain. It was a small, almost insignificant incident, yet it felt monumental. The world she had constructed, so orderly and secure, was about to be challenged in ways she never expected. Jane had always prided herself on living a life of quiet control. It wasn't that she actively avoided challenges. She simply didn't need them. There was no thrill in risk, no satisfaction in diving into the unknown. Her life was predictable, structured, just the way she liked it. The routine she had established over the years worked perfectly fine for her. It allowed her to maintain a sense of balance, of calm. But even the most stable of lives can sometimes feel a little too still, and it was in the subtle moments of her otherwise orderly existence that Jane began to sense something missing. She had never been a woman prone to wild dreams or reckless ambitions. The kind of life she lived, one marked by steady work, casual friendships, and the occasional vacation, was exactly what she had always envisioned. But recently, a quiet yearning had started to grow in her, a feeling she couldn't easily identify. It wasn't a desire for fame or fortune, nor was it something she could tangibly define. But there was an undeniable sense that she was missing out on something bigger than herself, something that felt just beyond her grasp. It was as if she were standing on the edge of something vast, and yet she couldn't bring herself to step over. Jane had tried to ignore the feeling at first, chalking it up to nothing more than the occasional passing thought. After all, hadn't she built her life on a foundation of calm? The thought of upheaval was uncomfortable, even frightening. She had spent so many years carving out a space where everything fit neatly into place. But lately, the idea of that space, of her life, felt a little too confining. There was a whisper in the back of her mind that maybe there was more to be discovered, more to be done. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the first inkling of her desire for change made itself known. Jane was sitting at her kitchen table, sipping her coffee, when she overheard a conversation between two of her neighbors. They were discussing their upcoming trip abroad, a visit to Europe, something she had always told herself she wasn't interested in. The conversation was lighthearted, filled with excitement about the adventures ahead. But as she listened, Jane felt a sense of longing stir inside her. She had never traveled much, preferring the comfort of her own home, the predictability of her routine. Yet, as she listened to the stories of far-off places, she realized how little she had explored outside of her little bubble. Jane tried to push the feeling away. She wasn't the type to daydream about exotic destinations or grand adventures. She had always found joy in the simple things, the comfort of her home, the quiet peace of her neighborhood, the familiar faces of her friends. And yet, the idea of stepping outside her comfort zone, of experiencing something new, started to occupy more of her thoughts. The idea of change, which had once seemed like a distant and unnecessary concept, suddenly felt both exciting and terrifying. What would it be like to leave behind the quiet predictability of her life? What would it be like to step into a world that was unknown, that was full of possibility? It wasn't just about travel. As Jane pondered the idea of change, she realized that there were other aspects of her life that had started to feel stagnant. Her work, which had once brought her a sense of fulfillment, had begun to feel repetitive. She was good at what she did. There was no question about that. Her freelance design work kept her busy enough, but she couldn't help but feel that she had reached a plateau. She had long ago mastered the art of designing for her clients, of meeting deadlines and delivering on expectations. But somewhere along the way, she had lost the spark of creativity that had once made her passion for design burn bright. The projects had become routine, and her work had started to feel like just another task to check off her list. This realization came in small waves, one after another. Jane would wake up and go through her usual motions, work, errands, meals, without thinking much about it. But when she paused, when she took a moment to reflect, she could feel it, an emptiness that was slowly creeping in. It was as if the fire inside her was fading, and she couldn't seem to reignite it. She told herself that this was normal, that this was just what happens when you get older. After all, wasn't it natural to settle into a rhythm as you got older? To let go of the wild ambitions of youth and embrace the simplicity of life? But Jane couldn't help but wonder if there was more to life than the same old routine, more to her existence than the role she had so comfortably settled into. It was during one of her late-night solo walks through the neighborhood that the thought really struck her. She had always found comfort in these solitary walks, as the soft glow of streetlights illuminated the quiet streets. The sound of her footsteps was a constant companion, steady and rhythmic, like the beat of her life. But that night, something felt different. As she walked, her thoughts began to drift beyond the familiar streets and homes. She thought about the wider world, about all the things she had never seen or done. She thought about people who had taken risks, people who had embraced uncertainty and change. She thought about what it must be like to step outside of everything you know and truly live. She could feel the weight of the questions settling inside her. What if she was missing out on something important by clinging so tightly to the life she had built? That night, Jane didn't sleep much. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of change. It wasn't just about the longing for something different. It was the growing sense that maybe her carefully curated life wasn't all it was cracked up to be. What if she had been so focused on stability and comfort that she had closed herself off to the world? What if her life, as perfect as it seemed on the surface, was actually incomplete? The questions haunted her, filling the quiet hours of the night. She wasn't sure what the answers were, but she knew one thing for sure. Something had to change. But change was a daunting prospect. It meant stepping away from the safety of what she knew, abandoning the comfort that had kept her anchored for so long. It meant facing fears she had long buried, confronting the unknown. It meant risking failure, disappointment, and rejection. The thought terrified her. She had always prided herself on her ability to maintain control, to manage her life with precision. Change, though, felt like surrendering that control. It felt like throwing herself into a sea of uncertainty, where she would be at the mercy of forces beyond her understanding. Yet, at the same time, there was a pull, an irresistible force urging her forward. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The yearning, the desire for something more, was too strong. It was as if her soul was calling out for a new chapter, for a story that was yet to be written. And as much as the idea of stepping into the unknown frightened her, she knew that staying where she was would only lead to a life of quiet regret. In the days that followed, Jane began to take small steps toward embracing the unknown. She signed up for a creative writing class, something she had always wanted to do, but had never found the time for. She started researching places to travel, though she had no specific destination in mind. She reached out to old friends, some of whom had taken more unconventional paths in life, and began to ask questions. She wasn't sure where this new desire for change would lead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of excitement. It was as if she had finally opened the door to something new, something beyond the life she had built so carefully. The decision to step out of her comfort zone didn't come easily for Jane. For years, she had lived a life that was structured, manageable, and safe. But as she mulled over the growing restlessness inside her, she began to realize that to answer the quiet whisper of change, she would have to take action. She couldn't keep waiting for the perfect moment. There would never be a perfect time to throw herself into something new. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that stepping into the unknown was the only way forward. The first step, she decided, was to break free from the self-imposed boundaries that she had erected over the years. Jane had always been meticulous about controlling her environment. Her routines, her career, even her social interactions were carefully curated to ensure stability and comfort. But now, in this moment of personal awakening, she knew that control had to be relinquished. In order to transform, she had to embrace the chaos that comes with growth. But even with this awareness, the thought of making that leap still felt terrifying. She didn't start with something grand or overwhelming. No, Jane understood that change didn't have to be a dramatic, all-encompassing event. It could be small, incremental steps that eventually led to a complete transformation. And so, she began with one of the most insignificant yet significant choices. She signed up for a creative writing course. It wasn't something she had ever seriously considered before. Jane had always been the practical type, grounded in logic and reason. But there was something deeply alluring about writing. The idea of creating something from nothing, of expressing herself in a way that was completely her own. The idea of the writing course had first been suggested by a friend during one of their casual meetups. Her friend, a free-spirited artist named Mia, had always encouraged Jane to follow her creative impulses, even when Jane had doubted her own abilities. "You have so many stories in you," Mia had told her one afternoon over coffee. "I think you'd surprise yourself if you just let them out." At the time, Jane had dismissed it as a passing suggestion, something that people say to encourage others but rarely mean. But now, in the quiet of her apartment, the idea had taken root in her mind, and she realized that it was time to explore that creative side she had long ignored. Signing up for the class was easy enough. Jane found a local workshop that met once a week and seemed like a good place to start. She was nervous, though. She had no formal writing experience, no degree in literature or creative writing. What if she wasn't good enough? What if the other participants were seasoned writers, already well-versed in the art of storytelling? The fear of inadequacy clawed at her, but she tried to push it aside. After all, this was the whole point of stepping outside her comfort zone, to face her fears head-on. The first day of the course arrived, and Jane was filled with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She arrived early, her heart pounding in her chest as she sat in the small classroom, waiting for the others to arrive. She couldn't help but notice the contrast between herself and the other participants. Some were younger, some older, but all of them seemed to carry an air of confidence. Some even brought notebooks filled with ideas, while Jane arrived with nothing but her quiet uncertainty. She felt like an outsider, someone who didn't quite belong in this space. But as the instructor, a gentle woman named Margaret, introduced herself and the course structure, Jane began to relax just a little. Margaret spoke with warmth and enthusiasm, encouraging the students to embrace vulnerability and to write from their hearts. "There's no right or wrong way to write," Margaret said with a smile. only your truth. And that's what matters most. Jane could feel the weight of those words settle in her chest, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could do this. As the class progressed, Jane found herself facing new challenges, both external and internal. The assignments felt daunting at first. How could she possibly come up with a story when she had never thought of herself as a storyteller? But each week, as she pushed through her doubts, she began to see progress. Margaret's assignments weren't just about writing for the sake of writing. They were exercises in self-reflection, in exploring parts of herself that she had long ignored. The prompts pushed Jane to think deeply about her emotions, her experiences, and her dreams. The act of writing itself became a form of therapy, a way for Jane to process the thoughts and feelings she had been suppressing for so long. But it wasn't just the writing that challenged Jane. It was the way it made her look at her own life. As she delved into her stories, she found herself reflecting on the relationships that had shaped her, the decisions she had made, and the person she had become. Writing allowed her to dig deeper into the recesses of her mind, uncovering parts of herself she had long buried. With each story, Jane unearthed something new, a memory, a regret, a fear. The process of putting words on the page forced her to confront her own vulnerabilities in a way she had never done before. But the unfamiliarity didn't stop there. Jane had always preferred to keep her personal life private. She wasn't one to share her thoughts with others, especially not in a group setting. Yet, each week, Margaret asked the students to share their writing with the class. At first, Jane hesitated. What if they didn't like her stories? What if they judged her? But Margaret's encouragement was unwavering, and soon Jane found herself sharing her work with others. It was uncomfortable at first, but there was something incredibly freeing about it as well. She could feel the weight of her own self-doubt slowly lifting as she allowed herself to be seen, flaws and all. As the weeks went by, Jane began to see a transformation in herself. The act of writing and sharing her work became a way for her to break free from the walls she had so carefully constructed around her life. For the first time in years, she was allowing herself to be vulnerable, to embrace uncertainty. The creative process was no longer a foreign concept. It was something that had become a part of her life, something she could return to whenever she needed to reconnect with herself. But despite the progress she was making in her writing, the other part of her longing, the desire for adventure, for something more, was still there, quietly tugging at her heart. She had taken the first step into the unknown, but it was clear that there was still more waiting for her. The writing class, though transformative in its own way, was only a small part of the bigger picture. Jane knew that to truly embrace change, she would have to step outside her own life, to explore new places, new experiences. The path she had started on was just the beginning. In the midst of this new chapter, Jane found herself at a crossroads. She had broken through some of the barriers that had held her back for so long. But now, with the foundation of change laid, she realized that the real test lay ahead. The decision to keep moving forward into the unfamiliar or retreat back into the safety of the known. The first few weeks of Jane's writing class had been exhilarating, but also deeply uncomfortable. She had pushed herself out of her comfort zone, signed up for something new, and began the process of confronting her own inner doubts. However, the real test of her commitment to change came when the initial rush of excitement began to wear off, and the challenges of the creative process started to feel more daunting than inspiring. The unfamiliar, once full of potential, now seemed vast and uncharted, a place she wasn't sure how to navigate. Her first few assignments were filled with uncertainty and hesitation. While Jane had always been a logical, goal-driven person, writing required a different kind of thinking, a fluidity and openness that she wasn't used to. It felt almost like trying to swim in water she wasn't sure she could breathe in. The blank page was her biggest enemy. It was one thing to have ideas in her head, but another to translate those ideas into something meaningful on paper. Each time she sat down to write, she was confronted with the fear that she wouldn't be able to express herself adequately, that the stories she wanted to tell wouldn't come out the way she imagined them. Her first story, a simple narrative about a memory from her childhood, was a struggle. Jane had wanted to write about a time when she and her brother had spent the summer at their grandparents' house in the country, but the words kept slipping through her fingers. She wasn't sure where to start, and when she did, the sentences felt stiff and uninspired. The act of revisiting that memory, one she had always thought of as simple and ordinary, was far more complex than she had anticipated. As she worked through it, she realized that her perceptions of her past were shifting. The memory she had thought of as a happy, carefree summer now seemed tinged with a sense of loss and nostalgia. But this was the beauty and difficulty of writing. It forced her to see things differently, to dig deeper into the layers of her own experiences. Despite her struggles, Jane had come to appreciate the beauty of the process. There were moments, fleeting though they were, when she caught a glimpse of the writer she wanted to become. The act of writing itself began to take on a meditative quality. It was no longer just about getting the words on the page. It was about exploring the nuances of her emotions, her thoughts, and her observations. It was about confronting the parts of herself that she had long ignored or repressed. Writing, she realized, had the power to make her see her own life through a new lens, to find meaning in the ordinary, to unearth truths she hadn't even known were there. But while writing had become an outlet for self-expression, it wasn't without its challenges. Each class brought new hurdles, both external and internal. The other students in the class were a mixed bag of experience levels. Some were seasoned writers, others were newcomers like her, but the dynamic often left Jane feeling self-conscious. She had never been one to share her vulnerabilities, but Margaret, the instructor, encouraged openness. During every session, she asked each student to share a piece of their writing. At first, Jane would shrink back, unsure of how her work would be received. She wasn't used to putting herself out there, especially in a creative context. But Margaret's encouragement was unyielding, and Jane gradually began to feel less afraid of judgment. One evening, after a particularly tough class, Jane found herself sitting in a small cafe across from the writing studio, staring down at her latest assignment. She had written about a relationship, a brief but intense friendship that had ended abruptly when she had moved to the city for her job. The story was raw, emotional, and she couldn't help but wonder if it was too much to share with the class. Was it too personal? Was it too revealing? It was a piece of her heart, a vulnerable part of her past, and the thought of sharing it with strangers made her feel exposed. She almost convinced herself to skip the sharing part of the class that week, to leave her paper in her bag and pretend like she hadn't written anything at all. But something inside her stopped her. She knew that to grow, to truly immerse herself in this process, she had to embrace the discomfort. When it was her turn, Jane took a deep breath and began reading. She stammered at first, her voice shaking with nerves, but as she spoke, something shifted. The words began to flow more freely, and by the time she finished, she felt a strange sense of relief. She had shared something personal, something real, and it wasn't as terrifying as she had imagined. The class responded with warmth and understanding, offering gentle feedback and praise. Jane's heart swelled with gratitude. For the first time, she realized that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. By sharing her story, she had invited others into her world, and in return, she had received their support. The more Jane wrote, the more she felt the weight of her internal struggles lifting. The process was not instantaneous, and there were still moments of doubt and frustration, but with each passing week, she began to see her progress. Her stories became more complex, more nuanced. She was no longer just writing about her past. She was exploring new possibilities for the future. The writing class had become her safe space, a place where she could stretch the boundaries of her identity and experiment with new ways of seeing the world. Outside the classroom, Jane's life had begun to reflect the changes she was making in her writing. She was taking more risks, speaking up more often at work, reaching out to old friends she had lost touch with, and even exploring new hobbies outside of writing. She found herself taking long walks in the park, letting her mind wander and imagine new storylines. She was starting to take more chances, to trust her intuition, and to embrace the unknown in ways she never had before. It was as if the act of writing had given her permission to live more fully, more freely. But there was still one challenge she hadn't yet faced: her fear of failure. Though she had made significant progress, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that she was only pretending to be a writer. What if she wasn't good enough? What if her stories were never as good as she wanted them to be? What if this whole thing was just a passing phase? These questions lingered in the back of her mind, clouding her confidence. There were days when she felt like quitting, when she wondered if she should just go back to the comfort of her old life, the one where everything was predictable and safe. But the more she wrote, the more she realized that failure was an inevitable part of growth. She couldn't expect perfection overnight. She had to trust the process, embrace the mistakes, and learn from them. After all, no one becomes great at something without first stumbling along the way. Jane's journey of adaptation was far from over, but she had come to understand that the struggles were just as important as the victories. They were what shaped her into the writer and the person she was becoming. Writing had taught her to be patient with herself, to trust that progress would come in its own time. And in the process, she had learned that change was not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. Through her words, she was discovering who she truly was, one sentence at a time. The weeks had passed in a blur. Jane had completed several assignments for her writing class, each one more challenging than the last, and each one providing a new layer of insight into herself. She had become more comfortable sharing her work with the class, and her stories had evolved from basic recollections of the past to deeply emotional explorations of the human experience. Her professor, Margaret, praised her for her improvement, even calling her work poignant and mature during one of the sessions. That validation was something Jane had craved, something she had never gotten from her rigid, corporate job or her more reserved circle of friends. It was during the third month of the class when Jane's sense of accomplishment reached a fever pitch. Margaret had announced that the final assignment for the course would be a longer piece, a short story between 3,000 to 5,000 words, which would serve as a culmination of everything they had learned. Jane, filled with a mix of excitement and determination, dove into the assignment with fervor. She felt ready, like the stories inside her were just waiting to be told. Her mind began to race with ideas. What story would truly showcase her growth? What narrative could encapsulate the lessons she had learned about vulnerability, emotion, and the complex layers of human relationships? After much deliberation, Jane decided to write a piece that focused on her experiences as a young woman trying to balance career aspirations with personal relationships. She had always felt torn between the expectations placed on her as a woman in the corporate world and the personal desires she had for a more meaningful, connected life. This story, she thought, would be a cathartic exploration of those conflicting parts of herself. She spent the first few days drafting the story, sitting in her favorite cafe, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The words came easily at first. The main character, a woman named Clara, was a reflection of Jane herself, someone ambitious, driven, yet constantly questioning whether success in her career would ever fill the emotional void she felt. Clara's internal struggles mirrored Jane's own, and as she wrote, Jane found herself getting lost in the character's world. She felt a deep connection to Clara, a sense of understanding that transcended the pages of her story. It was as if Jane had unlocked something within herself through her writing, something that had been buried for years. However, as the days passed, the pressure began to mount. The weight of the assignment was no longer just a task to be completed. It had become a personal mission. Jane's perfectionism, something she had battled her entire life, began to creep into her writing process. She obsessively reread each paragraph, making small changes here and there, convinced that every sentence had to be flawless. Her internal critic, the one that had once been quiet in her corporate life, had now taken center stage in her creative endeavors. She began to question whether she was even capable of finishing the story, of capturing the essence of her experience in a way that would resonate with others. What if the story wasn't good enough? What if Margaret and her classmates didn't understand the message she was trying to convey? This self-doubt paralyzed Jane for days. She spent hours staring at the screen, unsure of what to write next. The pressure to succeed had turned her creative process into something rigid and lifeless. She was no longer writing to explore her emotions. She was writing to meet an expectation, one that had nothing to do with the heart of her story. In an attempt to overcome this feeling, she decided to take a break from writing and read some of her past assignments, hoping to regain the sense of flow she had once experienced. But as she read through her work, she found herself being overly critical, picking apart each story for its flaws rather than appreciating the raw honesty that had made them unique. It was in the midst of this internal struggle that Jane had an epiphany. She realized that, in her pursuit of perfection, she had lost sight of why she started writing in the first place: to express herself, to explore the depths of her own thoughts and feelings, not to impress others or meet some arbitrary standard of excellence. The joy of writing had been replaced by the anxiety of judgment, and Jane had allowed that fear to cloud her creative vision. She closed her laptop, took a deep breath, and decided to write the story she had always wanted to tell, without the pressure to make it perfect. Over the next few days, Jane poured herself into the story once more, but this time with a sense of freedom. She stopped worrying about what others might think and focused solely on the act of writing. Clara's story began to take on a life of its own. She wasn't just writing about a woman struggling to balance her career and personal life. She was writing about the universal experience of feeling lost and searching for meaning. She was writing about the human need for connection and authenticity in a world that often demanded conformity. When Jane finally finished the story, she felt a sense of accomplishment unlike any she had experienced before. She had completed the assignment, yes, but more importantly, she had allowed herself to be vulnerable and honest in her writing. It was the first time she felt truly proud of something she had created, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. She submitted the story to Margaret, eager to see how it would be received, but also, for the first time, content with the fact that she had written it for herself. The day of the final class arrived, and Jane sat nervously in the classroom, her story clutched tightly in her hands. When it was her turn to share, she read her piece aloud, feeling the familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. The words seemed to echo in her mind as she spoke, but this time, she didn't stop herself. She didn't second-guess her choice of words or worry about the meaning being lost. She allowed the emotions behind the story to come through, trusting that it would resonate with the class in some way. When she finished, there was a long silence before Margaret spoke. "Jane," Margaret said, her voice filled with admiration, "this is beautiful. You've captured something so raw and genuine here. I can feel the emotional depth in the story, and I think you've really found your voice as a writer. You've come a long way." Jane's heart swelled with pride, but a small voice inside her couldn't help but wonder, was this the victory she had been seeking all along? She had done everything she thought she needed to do, completed the assignment, earned the praise, and even felt a sense of accomplishment. But was this really the success she had been chasing for so long? Or had she missed the point entirely? The false victory became apparent as she reflected on it. Her accomplishment, sharing her story and receiving validation from her peers, was meaningful, but it was also fleeting. She realized that the process of writing wasn't about getting it right or earning praise from others. It was about the journey itself, the exploration of one's own truth, and the willingness to be vulnerable in the face of uncertainty. Her true growth lay not in the accolades she had received, but in the transformation that had taken place within her during the process. In the end, Jane realized that the story wasn't about the external validation. It was about the internal freedom she had found by embracing the messiness of the creative process. It was in letting go of perfection and allowing herself to fail, to stumble, and to learn along the way that she had truly found the success she had been searching for all along. In the days following her submission of the story to Margaret, Jane felt the afterglow of her accomplishment begin to fade. She had received praise in class, which she had never quite anticipated would feel so hollow. At first, it seemed like the validation she had longed for, like it was the key that would unlock all the doors she had dreamed of opening for years. But as the days wore on, Jane started to feel something unsettling take root inside of her. The recognition from her classmates and professor, while flattering, felt superficial. She had been so consumed by the external praise that she hadn't truly stopped to consider the deeper, more uncomfortable truths that had come to light in the process. As she reflected on the feedback, Jane began to realize how much she had been willing to sacrifice in her quest for success. In trying so hard to write the perfect story, she had been blinded to the fundamental reason why she started writing in the first place: to express herself, to understand her emotions, to explore the complexities of her existence. Writing had been her escape, her sanctuary, a place where she could lay her feelings bare and make sense of the chaos that often seemed to rule her life. But somewhere along the way, it had become a competition, a race to see how perfectly she could perform, how flawless her words could be. She had gotten caught up in the notion of being good enough rather than just being herself. This realization hit Jane harder than she could have imagined. It wasn't just that her creative expression had been compromised, it was that her entire approach to life had been tainted by the need for validation. For as long as she could remember, she had placed her worth in the hands of others, whether it was her parents, her colleagues, or now, her classmates and professor. Her desire to be seen as capable, intelligent, and successful had driven her to achieve at any cost, but in doing so, she had neglected the one thing that truly mattered: authenticity. This false sense of success had come at a much higher price than she had ever anticipated. At first, she tried to push away these thoughts. After all, she had succeeded in the class, hadn't she? She had completed the assignment, received praise, and felt like her writing had improved. There was no reason for her to feel disappointed or disillusioned, she reasoned. Yet, the more she ignored the unease within her, the more it festered, gnawing at her in ways that she couldn't explain. She felt like an imposter, someone who had convinced others of her abilities without truly understanding what those abilities meant to her on a personal level. The praise she had received had begun to feel like a hollow echo, a reminder that she had been living in a space of illusion, rather than truth. Jane's internal conflict grew in intensity. One evening, she sat at her desk, staring at her unfinished manuscript. The words she had written in the final weeks of the course now seemed foreign to her, like they had come from someone else, someone she no longer recognized. The story that had once felt like an intimate part of herself had been tainted by the need for approval. The desire to please had taken over the act of creation, and in doing so, it had robbed her of the joy she had once found in her writing. It was then that she realized that the very thing she had been seeking validation had also become the very thing that had imprisoned her. Her dissatisfaction wasn't just about the story, it was about her entire approach to life. Jane had spent so many years working tirelessly to prove herself in her corporate job, constantly striving for accolades and recognition from her superiors, only to realize that all the success in the world couldn't fill the emptiness she felt inside. Her professional life had been driven by a need to be good enough in the eyes of others, and now, even in her creative pursuits, that same need had crept in, poisoning her passion and sense of self-worth. She had been so focused on what others thought of her that she had forgotten how to think for herself, how to listen to her own voice without filtering it through the lens of external judgment. That night, Jane couldn't sleep. The weight of her realizations pressed heavily on her chest, and she felt as though she had been living in a fog for years. She wondered how much of her life had been spent chasing approval, only to discover that it had never been the approval she truly needed. It had been a fleeting form of validation, a mask she had put on to shield herself from the vulnerability of being honest and authentic. What had she really achieved? She had gained the praise of her professor, but in doing so, she had lost something far more valuable: her connection to her own truth. The next day, Jane decided to take a break from the world of writing. She didn't return to the cafe or sit at her desk trying to fix her story. Instead, she spent the day alone, walking through the park near her apartment. It had been a while since she had taken time for herself in such a simple, unstructured way. As she wandered through the green spaces, watching families walk by and children play, Jane realized how much she had been missing in her pursuit of perfection. She had been so focused on the destination, the achievement, that she had forgotten to enjoy the journey, to embrace the moments of peace and clarity that came from simply being present. It was during this walk that Jane had an epiphany, She needed to stop running from herself. She had been avoiding the discomfort that came with being vulnerable, with being imperfect, because it felt safer to hide behind the facade of success and accomplishment. But true fulfillment, she realized, came not from external validation, but from accepting her flaws, her fears, and her mistakes. Only then could she truly be free to create, to live, and to grow. That afternoon, Jane sat down with a notebook and began writing, not for a class assignment or to impress anyone, but simply for herself. She wrote about her fear of failure, her struggles with self-doubt, and the pressure she had placed on herself to achieve. The words flowed easily this time, as if they had been waiting to be released. There was no judgment, no fear of what others would think. It was a raw, unfiltered reflection of who she was and what she had been through. She didn't know where this new form of writing would take her, but for the first time in months, she felt truly alive, unencumbered by the need for approval. In the days that followed, Jane continued to write in this new way, exploring her deepest emotions and fears without fear of judgment. The heavy price she had paid for the false victory of external validation had opened her eyes to the truth. Authenticity was worth far more than any praise or recognition. As she embraced this new approach to writing and to life, Jane began to heal. She understood now that she didn't need to be perfect to be worthy. She just needed to be real. Her creative process had been transformed, and she knew that the road ahead would be one of continual growth and self-discovery. The price of her false victory had been steep, but it had led her to the most valuable lesson she could ever learn, that true fulfillment comes not from external success, but from the internal freedom to be herself, flaws and all. As the weeks passed, Jane gradually returned to her life, but she was no longer the same person who had first submitted her story to Margaret's class. She had learned valuable lessons that would stick with her for a long time. The anxiety that had once plagued her, the insatiable desire for approval, and the constant comparisons with others no longer seemed as pressing or important. Instead, she found herself more at ease in her own skin, accepting her imperfections and embracing the beauty of the creative process, unencumbered by the need for validation. The lessons she had learned had left a lasting impact on the way she viewed herself, her art, and her future. Returning to her daily routine, Jane was careful to not let the weight of her realization fade into the background. She had become more intentional with how she spent her time. Instead of filling every moment with tasks that seemed necessary for the sake of progress or success, she began to prioritize moments of stillness. Writing for herself, not for anyone else, became a sacred act, one that offered her a sense of peace and fulfillment, rather than anxiety and stress. She didn't write for grades, for praise, or for recognition anymore. She wrote because it was something that brought her joy, something that helped her explore the depths of her emotions and connect with the world in a way that no other medium could. Her relationship with writing had shifted, but her relationship with herself had undergone an even more profound transformation. For years, Jane had struggled with self-doubt, always feeling like she wasn't quite enough, not smart enough, not creative enough, not worthy enough. She had spent so much of her life chasing external markers of success, thinking they would somehow fill the emptiness she felt inside. Yet, after confronting the truth about her motivations, Jane had learned that those external markers were never going to provide her with the lasting fulfillment she craved. True fulfillment, she now understood, came from within. It came from self-acceptance, from embracing the journey, and from being honest with herself about her strengths and weaknesses. One afternoon, as she sat at her favorite cafe, Jane received an email from Margaret. The subject line read, "Feedback on your story." A wave of nervousness washed over her, but this time, it wasn't the usual anxious anticipation of approval or disapproval. It was a calm curiosity. She had come to realize that the feedback was just one piece of the puzzle, not the ultimate measure of her worth. Opening the email, she read Margaret's comments with a sense of openness, unafraid of what she might find. Margaret had praised the story, acknowledging Jane's ability to convey emotion and create vivid characters. But there was one thing that stood out to Jane in Margaret's feedback. something that hadn't caught her attention during her first read-through. Margaret had written, "I think there's a deeper layer to your story that you're not tapping into yet. Your writing is beautiful, but it feels like you're holding back something important." At first, Jane was taken aback. What could Margaret mean by that? Hadn't she just exposed everything she needed to? But as she sat with the comment, it began to make sense. In her pursuit of perfection and external validation, Jane had been hiding behind the surface of her writing. She had been so concerned with getting it right that she had neglected to explore the rawest parts of herself, those places where vulnerability and truth resided. It was as if Margaret had seen something Jane hadn't yet allowed herself to see. There was still a deeper part of her story, one that had yet to be told. The comment was a revelation. Jane realized that the feedback wasn't about her worth or her abilities. It was about growth, about pushing herself beyond the boundaries of what she thought she could do. It was an invitation to dig deeper, to challenge herself, and to continue her creative journey without the fear of failure. This feedback was a call to lean into the discomfort and explore the unknown, to embrace her voice and allow it to evolve. Jane had spent so much of her life trying to get everything right, but the truest form of creation came from accepting the messiness of the process. The following weeks were marked by a period of intense self-reflection and writing. Jane didn't immediately dive into another polished, perfected story. Instead, she allowed herself to explore, to write freely without worrying about the structure, the outcome, or the judgment of others. She wrote about her fears, her doubts, and her desires, things she had never fully expressed before. She allowed herself to get messy, to make mistakes, and to feel vulnerable in the process. Writing became a form of self-expression rather than a means to an end. During this time, Jane also began to reconnect with her community of fellow writers. At first, she had distanced herself from them, afraid that they might judge her for her imperfections. But now, she realized that true connection came from sharing openly, without fear. She started attending writing workshops again, not with the goal of impressing anyone, but with the desire to learn, to grow, and to connect. She was no longer competing with her peers. Instead, she was collaborating, exchanging ideas, and offering support. One evening, at a local writing meetup, Jane ran into an old friend from college who had always been a fierce critic of her work. This friend had been one of the people who had unknowingly reinforced her need for validation by constantly pointing out areas where Jane could improve. In the past, Jane would have felt defensive, eager to prove herself and show that she had what it took. But now, when they talked about her recent work, Jane felt a sense of calm. She listened to her friend's critique with an open mind, knowing that it was just one perspective among many, and that her worth wasn't tied to her writing alone. The conversation wasn't about seeking approval, it was about growth and learning from one another. That night, as Jane sat on her couch, reflecting on the interactions of the day, she realized how far she had come. She had come full circle. Her return to familiar ground wasn't about reclaiming old habits or reverting to her previous mindset. It was about embracing a new way of being. She had learned to accept herself, to release the pressure of perfection, and to create for the sake of creation. The lessons she had learned had brought her peace. Peace in knowing that her value wasn't defined by others' opinions or the number of accolades she received. She was enough just as she was. And as Jane picked up her pen to write once more, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. Freedom to be authentic. Freedom to make mistakes. Freedom to create for herself, without fear, without shame, and without the weight of expectations. She wasn't writing to be praised, to be validated, or to meet some external standard of success. She was writing because it was her truth.
And that was enough.
In the end, Jane had not only discovered a new approach to her craft, but also a new approach to life. She was no longer defined by what others thought of her or by the external measures of success. She had come to understand that true fulfillment came not from perfection, but from embracing the messiness of life, from accepting her vulnerabilities, and from being courageous enough to share her authentic self with the world. And with that, Jane continued her journey, not as the person she once was, but as the person she had become, a writer who no longer sought approval, but simply sought to be true to herself.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.